Hello, Matt and Chris.
Hey, Bob.
Hello, Bob.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Matthew Browne and Christopher Kavanagh, and I'll let you say a little bit more about yourselves in just a second. Let me say right now that we are going to talk about secular gurus, what they are, why there seem to be so many of them, whether we should find this abundance alarming. And for all these questions and more, I turn to you because you are hosts of a podcast called Decoding the Gurus, which I've become something of a fan of. And so why don't we, at this point, let you both tell us why you feel personally qualified to opine on gurus. What is it about your credentials and or day jobs that give you this power?
You're the older, wiser senior member of the team. Why don't you go first and share your wisdom?
Let me say, for people just listening, the Australian accent will be Matt Browne. The kind of Irish accent, possibly with a little Japanese thrown in. I'm not sure. Chris is in Japan, but it's, is there, Chris, yeah, let's get to the important stuff first. Is there something a little unusual about your Irish accent?
Many things, but probably the most notable is it's Northern Irish. Like I grew up in Belfast, so primarily it's a Belfast accent. But it has been remarked by people in Northern Ireland to have some strange qualities. I mean, they're classified as having a very broad Belfast accent, like a West Belfast accent, or having an accent which is hard to identify as Northern Irish. And then because I have lived in Japan for quite a long time and been around non-native English speakers, even including actually living in London where people didn't find Northern Irish accent easy to understand, my accent is now probably a weird amalgamation, but the Belfast pronunciation is the primary feature. Is
the essence of it. Okay. So that is Chris. Now we turn to the Australian accent, Matt, and Chris apparently wants you to go first, Matt, in talking about
I'll go first as the senior partner in this. So I'm a professor in psychology at Central Queensland University. And, I've been a, researcher and academic for like 20 years now. Started off in artificial intelligence, but moved into statistics and stuff, and done a lot of general kind of social psychological research on addiction, but also on stuff like religiosity, conspiracy theories, and what we might call non-evidence-based beliefs, including anti-vax and other types of things. So, yeah, that's my background.
Okay, Chris?
I'm also an academic and associate professor at a university called Rikkyo in Tokyo, and I have a joint position at Oxford University as a researcher. And my field is not that far off, but I kind of work in the hinterlands between cognitive anthropology, the more quantitative side of anthropology, and psychology, social and experimental psychology. So I teach in a psychology department in Japan, and I'm employed in the anthropology department in Oxford. And my research in academic sense focuses around like religion and beliefs and rituals, the kind of cognitive psychology of ritual mainly. So I work primarily in a field called the cognitive science of religion, which you might be familiar with, Bob. And then, but I also work on group psychology and the formation of group identities and communities. So that sort of overlaps with my interest in conspiracy theorists and pseudoscience communities, but that has really been a long-standing interest since the beginnings of my interest in academia. So that's been running parallel, and I tried to make them intersect, but this focus on gurus is probably a more recent development.
Okay. So let's talk about a little bit about what you mean by secular gurus. And let me say, I encourage you both to just dive in whenever you want. I won't direct questions at either, but you seem to know each other well enough that your relationship will survive any alpha competition
Yeah, we know who's Batman and who's Robin in this relationship. We don't need to get into it.
We'll let people figure that out, and then at the end you can tell them the correct answer. So people, I'm sure, would like to know, what is a secular guru? It's kind of clear, given your backgrounds, why you would be interested in regular gurus, right? I mean, classic gurus, spiritual gurus, religious gurus would seem right up your alley, but that's not what your podcast is about. Each episode, your non-special episodes, you have these special episodes where you kind of approach the subject from maybe a slightly different angle. But in the classic version of your podcast, you will take on one of these secular gurus, and you do something that I think has value in its own right, independent of the guru thing, and which I would like to see more of, which is you take an actual recording, often a podcast featuring this guru, and you kind of take it apart. You do a little bit of a play-by-play. You actually play clips from it and comment on them. And I think that should become a genre in its own right. You know, like podcasts that review podcasts in various realms, gurus aside. Yeah. And that's one thing I enjoy about it. But let me, give people the sequence of, should I say, subjects or targets? Anyway, the sequence of people you commented on. The first episode was about Bret and Eric Weinstein. I assume most people know them. They are associated with the so-called intellectual dark web. After that, it was James Lindsay, Jordan Peterson, another, these are all kinds of IDW-ish, anti-woke-ish people. And at that point, I might have thought, that's what you're going to do. You went on to do some people on the left, Rutger Bregman, ContraPoints, Ibram X. Kendi. But I have to ask, given the first few, was the original inspiration for this like getting annoyed by people in the intellectual dark web or anti-wokeism or what? How did this whole thing get off the ground?
I'm trying to remember, Chris. What made us start doing this?
Yeah, I think the original motivation was like, and maybe this might be a little bit meandering, Bob, but it might address like a bunch of those points, is that, like most people online, we are involved in the culture war by choice or by simply existing online. And there's various aspects of that which are annoying and grating. But one of the things was the emergence of figures who seem to occupy the kind of space that you would traditionally associate with guru figures, and the same kinds of level devotion, right? Like Jordan Peterson is a good example. Not just a public intellectual, but somebody inspiring like genuine emotional commitment from fans. But what they were pushing tended to be not really, and Jordan Peterson's sort of an exception because he does include religious elements into what he promotes. But the majority of the figures were not focused on a religious component to it. And in some respects, the political messages, even though they're definitely there, they're often kind of subsumed as, well, those are just secondary features from their scientific or approach or that kind of thing. And I think that Matt and we were noticing these recurrent features in a lot of the figures in the culture war. And we started talking about writing a paper to, because we're academics. So we made a shared Google Doc where we noted down features and started sketching out the skeleton of a paper to write together. And then we were talking about, well, it would be good to catalog examples of this, and we are discussing these things anyway. So maybe we should start thinking about, recording something to release where we can. So the podcast idea came out of the initial collaboration on a paper, which is
basically procrastination. Yeah, that's right. It was basically procrastination. So to avoid having to write the paper.
In what sense now? You were working on a paper related to this, and you said, a podcast would be easier than writing an actual paper, or what?
No.
Yeah, kind of.
I think we were having discussions about the people that we were covering and, the features that we were identifying on Skype, and they were quite enjoyable. And then I was on Twitter quite often doing breakdowns, like similar, kind of tweet thread breakdowns of podcasts from the figures that I'd read. So it's, I'd been considering making some content that, don't know podcasts or articles or whatnot. But after talking with Matt, I got the idea that it would be like that we could try and make a podcast about breaking down the content that we're discussing anyway. And then it kind of took a life of its own as we went on. And it's now the paper is kind of in the background, but still hoping to be finished.
We're going to get around to it. Yeah, like once we started cataloging them, we tried to identify what the common themes were. What were and when we sat down to do that, and we were just sort of brainstorming and building up a kind of rough document, we began to realize there were these same kind of themes which we could identify in a whole bunch of these different guru types. And it definitely had resonances with stuff that we'd studied before in terms of these sort of cult-like aspects, in terms of conspiracy theories, in terms of, like, there's a whole academic subfield of bullshitology, basically, which is to understand bullshit and the way that people can communicate while appearing to be saying something truthy while actually saying very little or something quite mundane. And also, of course, these sort of anti-establishment, paranoid kind of narratives and, or warning of a coming apocalypse, of some terrible events that are going to transpire. So we started spotting essentially the same themes across these multiple gurus. They had these sort of often self-help or religious or spiritual aspects to them. But as Chris said, with the exception of Jordan Peterson, most of them really are nominally totally secular. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now, so not all the things you mentioned would apply to all the people you've focused on, right? Like the conspiracy, not all these people are into conspiracy theories probably, and not all of them envision an apocalypse. I mean, it seems to me that one thing that, well, it's almost bound to be true of them in a way, but that they have a fan base that includes, at least to some extent, some, what you might call irrational attachment. In other words, people being persuaded by something other than pure reason. Does that make sense? I hesitate to even suggest that could be a distinction, because I think, given the nature of human belief, there's usually some of that, right? I mean, when people become a fan of anyone, any columnist or whatever, they start attributing some authority to them that can give the person the power to persuade at least some of their fans without really making rock solid arguments, right? I mean, that's just life in the discourse business to some extent. Is that right?
Well, I think
what we try to do is.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
Go on, Chris. No, you go ahead.
All right.
I may have to arbitrate if this humility thing gets out of control. I may have to designate speakers, but go ahead.
Well, so I think the point that you made about, the traits that we identify existing on the spectrum is exactly true. And I would also add that it's more a family resemblance kind of category, right? That it isn't that everybody that we cover will have all of the features, but just that these features are recurrent. And if you're high in all of the points that we identify, the chances that you're a guru are like very, very high. But in that same respect, there are always aspects to the features that we focus on, and also just to opining in a public setting, where there, like, that you will build a following, that people will, who like what you say, will be more positively disposed to you. But there's a spectrum of these things, and the distinction, so the kind of distinction between a guru and somebody who's a public intellectual is often the degree to which they encourage that level of attachment, or the extent to which they present their ideas as revolutionary, and so on. So the one other point I would make is that something which I think distinguishes us from some of the other people that discuss these things is that you asked, is it because we wanted to respond to anti-woke stuff? And it definitely isn't that, because a lot of the criticisms that people might have of like the kind of woke movement, or whatever you want to call it, I see validity to those. And like in vice versa, there's validity to criticisms that people make of, the growth of the popular right or that kind of thing. But so the objection that I have is not usually based on that it's a ideological or kind of political disagreement with that we shouldn't criticize people who are, too woke, or that kind of thing. It's not based on a political foundation, basically. Matt, sorry.
Yeah, the other little point of clarification there, Bob, is that we, not everyone we cover is like a bad guru, right? So we'd go mad if everyone we covered was kind of terrible, if you like. So it's fun to have these points of contrast as well. So, and also to be surprised. So, we've covered some of our own personal kind of gurus. Like I chose Carl Sagan, and Chris chose a guy that nobody's heard of, Anthony DeMello. And we're looking forward to covering people kind of cold, coming at them a little and and having really no idea beforehand what our opinion's going to be. And yeah, as Chris said, what we really try to do is focus on the structure and form of what they're doing, rather than sort of agreeing or disagreeing with them personally about whatever it is they're arguing for. So, for instance, Ibrahim X. Kendi is obviously very well known for pushing his particular theories about, critical race theory and so on. But really our focus was on, and anti-racism rather. But really our focus was he expressing himself clearly? Was he doing these sort of rhetorical sleights of hand? And, was what he was saying logically coherent, rather than sort of going, we're either for or against his particular brand of anti-racism, just as an example.
Right. I would say it's pretty much always the case, maybe with the exception of your personal gurus like Carl Sagan, but you only did one of those each. It seems to be always the case. You find something that you believe is, if not flat out bullshit, some kind of logical error, or sometimes just a flat out manipulative, rhetorical technique. So, and that's, when I said, I think this genre needs to, become broader, that I would like to see all kinds of podcast reviews of podcasts. I think it would just be healthy if people were held accountable. And, if somebody thinks that somebody says something on a podcast that's bullshit, there'd be a place where that claim is made. And there's something good about the audio, about hearing it and then hearing you talk about it. It's just, there's something, effective about staying within the medium that you're talking about. So let me go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the one issue is though that there can be, like what you're talking about, Bob, I think does exist, right? Especially on YouTube, people reacting to reactions of reactions, right? And one issue with it is that it becomes a self-indulgent hall of mirrors, or kind of caught up in these little feuds and group debates that, anybody outside of the online environment has very little interest in. So that can happen. But the point that you, I think, are getting at more broadly about that, people who do these, like, say, 3-hour podcasts, right? Like Joe Rogan and Bret Weinstein recently did a 3-hour podcast. Now, there was a lot said in that was shocking, like shockingly bad. But the majority of people, even their critics, are not going to sit and listen to a 3-hour discussion between them and rebut the points, because it's massively time consuming, and it's also infuriating if you are finding the things that they're saying annoying, right? So that's something which Matt and I do regularly, which I actually think is valuable, because then for our audience, who actually a fair amount of them were, or at least previously, fans of the Weinsteins, but I think it is good for people, like you say, to be exposed to hear people that they don't actually hear. They just have a caricature in their mind, and maybe it's accurate, but when you actually hear the way that they rhetorically set things up, you can often see, I think, how they make it appeal to their audience, and why people might spend 3 hours to listen to Joe Rogan and the Heller and Bret discuss, how innovative that they all are. I think you're right that, you're right. The genre of criticism, of intra-medium criticism, definitely exists on YouTube. The trouble is that the YouTube algorithm incentivizes you to just do this trash talk, or at least depict the thing that way. It incentivizes you to put a screenshot on it that says, James Lindsay demolishes Ibram X. Kendi, right? I mean, and that's clickbait, and that gets going. And so what I'm actually advocating is something a little more reflective and considered, and less sensationalistic than that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, the vast majority of this kind of material is done by haters, right? So, and that is just, in my opinion, really just layering rhetoric on top of rhetoric. So, I mean, we're God knows we're not perfect, especially Chris, but we try we try not to do that, and we do try to make a point of, especially even when they are pretty bad overall, we try to identify at least some things that they do all right on and are fine with, just as a kind of discipline apart from anything else. Because if we can't see, I think it's a good heuristic that most people, even gurus, are not entirely bad.
I agree. Even gurus are not entirely bad. Now, so maybe we should, well, let me ask one more general question, and then let's talk about some of the gurus. But the general question is, Daniel Dresner, this foreign policy kind of scholar and blogger, wrote a book about, in which he made a distinction between public intellectuals and thought leaders. And he clearly thought, like, public intellectuals were good. Thought leaders were an unfortunate kind of product of our times. They were the ones who do superficial TED Talks or whatever. I forget the exact definition. But, I'm wondering if you want to talk about whether this secular guru thing maps on to the thought leader concept, you can. But my more fundamental question is, do you think, as Dan thinks about thought leaders, that secular gurus are kind of a product of our time? I mean, I'm sure you can go back and find examples in past times, but is there like a proliferation of them? And is there, some of them talk about the crisis of authority, right? And how nobody knows who to believe, and that's a problem. And so you should believe them. But I mean, is there a real crisis of authority that their proliferation reflects? Is there a proliferation of them? Or like, is this just a kind of a new label, for something that's always been with us in abundance, or what?
So, I think that it's a very academic answer, but there's kind of elements of both. There's the element of like old wine in new bottles. Like if you're familiar with conspiracy theories or anti-vaccine communities or whatever, you can see the rhetoric, like the kind of DNA from the old, well-known communities and advocates reflected in the new gurus or the rhetoric that they're offering. So there's lots of kind of connective tissue to older conspiracy theories, and also including to references like the John Birch Society or going out of my head, the progenitor of Alex Jones. I forget his name, the guy who wrote Behold the Pale Horse. But when you listen to them, you can see a lot of the same kind of, a lot of the same kind of themes, a lot of the same kind of manipulative techniques. But the thing which is, I think, different, and which I do think it reflects on something new, is partly to do with the online ecosystems that now exist, social media, and the ability to access this kind of thought, whereas before, to some extent, you had to seek it out and you had to, be motivated to kind of find those communities and get those books. Now, to find a 3-hour discussion of ivermectin, it's just a click away. And even if you don't want to see it, you probably will if you're on Twitter. So that's different. But also, I think there has been with it's a very broad trend about decline of neoliberal consensus, or whatever way you want to put it. And the woke movement, I think, is an outgrowth of that as well, that there is a crisis of meaning or epistemology, and people are searching for answers and ideologies, and there's plenty of people willing to give it. That situation has come about like lots of times in lots of cycles, but I think we're just in a new one that's particularly potent and is reflected in political developments with the rise of populism and all of that kind of thing. So yeah, I think epistemic crisis and the rise of the new social media environments is helping these people to grow and reach massive audiences. That's kind of the worrying aspect of it.
Matt, are you worried? You're nodding your head.
Yeah.
Is it worrying? Because you've taken pains to say they're not all bad. There are, and your assessments, and of course, I'm sure you admit you have your ideological perspective. I suspect you've been accused of evincing it in the course of your assessments of these people. It seems to me you may be a little quicker to get to the criticisms with some people on the right than you spent a fair amount of time saying nice things about Ibram X. Kendi before you got to criticisms. Not so much with Scott Adams, not so much with the Weinsteins. Yeah. So there's that you can comment on if you want, but the background question is, so you do think there's an actually alarming trend here, in response to, I guess I would see the crisis of authority as having two potential sources. One, there's the famous decline of religious authority, right? Or at least traditional religious authority, and as reflected in percentage of people who go to church and things like that. And then there is something that I think is largely a product of changes in the technology of media, which is just that there are no longer 3 TV networks in America, and it is no longer a kind of monopoly on authority at the top, and so you see all these flowers and or weeds, depending on your perspective, just kind of springing up to fill the void. But that's a long-winded way of asking, you do think there's something a little unsettling going on here?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Chris that, although in some ways it's a it's the same things have happened before with snake oil salesmen of various kinds and, barefooted preachers in the street sort of thing. And, but it is just simply the technology, has created, the new opportunities. And I guess also, as Chris said, that cultural moment with this crisis in epistemology and confidence in neoliberal institutions. And you're seeing that both on the left and the right. So, and in some weird spheres, you see this sort of horseshoeing kind of things happening as well. Say Russell Brand, for instance, it's quite surreal. Look, I'm going to defend our relatively positive review of Abraham X. Kendi because I knew very little about him before we covered him. And my assumption, except for what people said about him on Twitter, and from what I knew from that, which is probably what most people know, I thought we were going to totally pan him. That's what was my expectation. And in terms of my just sort of general kind of worldview, in Australia, we don't have the same kind of racial angst generally, I would say, as is currently going on in America. So I sort of raise an eyebrow at all of it. So that's where I was coming from. So I sort of reject a little bit that we're sort of more, ideologically sympathetic to Kendi and therefore gave him an easy ride. We're actually quite surprised how, his arguments were clear and logical and presented in quite an academic kind of way. You can definitely disagree with the premises and the assumptions that underlie it, and therefore say that the entire thing is flawed. And so, but in a way, in that case, your problem is with the sort of critical theory arm of academia and the kind of it's not with him personally. It's more with the entire sort of intellectual substructure on which he bases his work on. But that's not our focus with gurus. Yeah, it's very much we're not about going so deep, I suppose. Chris?
There's one thing, Bob, I'd add is that looking back at history of conspiracy theories and like gurus and whatnot, I'm 100% certain that in 100 years' time, after we're all dead, or robot versions of us are still around, but there will be other people sitting here talking about the new crop of, robot gurus or whatever they are, probably just people like us, complaining about the same kind of issues. And, every time I read a history book about that kind of thing, I'm amazed at how many things are similar, and they're just, with different technologies and that kind of limitation. But I think that with Matt and I, because we're academics and that's our background, that we have a bit of a bias towards academic-y type stuff. And in particular, we're both interested in the way that people approach topics scientifically, right, or presented as scientific, and the way that they tell people about these good heuristics to find good information or to examine topics. And as a result of that, like someone like Kendi, they've got fairly crazy definitions of the terms, and that's what their whole framework rests on. But academics meeting somebody that has like a strange theory that relies on their bespoke definitions is something that happens every day. And you just kind of be like, okay, so you've got a theory that I don't buy into, but it rests on these definitions, which I just don't think apply. So it's not that upsetting. On the other hand, when you have gurus who are saying that, like, this is what science is, I'm teaching you, I'm giving the audience what real science is about, and what they're giving their audience is kind of heuristics that will lead them towards pseudoscience or towards rank partisanship. Like, I have more concern for that, but I don't know if it's concerned that, like, the sky is falling and everyone's going to fall into it, or more that it's just teaching a lot of people who are interested in these topics and could be coming across better material, like, bad habits of thinking that are gonna, that have impacts, like with vaccine hesitancy and that kind of thing. So, I don't think it's particularly 100% unique, but it's still concerning, as it will be in the future.
Yeah. I think if we get triggered by anything, it's the gurus who really work hard to undermine people's confidence in other the sort of conventional sources of knowledge, institutions, whether it's scientists, whether it's medical practitioners, often, I kind of and it plays on a paranoia, I suppose, that people have, that these technocrats and very, special people in the ivory tower in Washington are kind of pulling the strings. And so it has that conspiratorial background to it. But if you look at the characters that are sort of more, heading IDW or Wright, like Eric Weinstein or James Lindsay or Jordan Peterson, or there's a long list of them. You're right. They do tend to have a rightward bias, but the fact remains is that these are the ones who are really actively working to sort of sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt, to steal Eric Weinstein's one of his famous acronyms. Except he was using it to describe what the authorities do, whereas I think that's what they do. And you just seem to see more of it coming from the right at the moment.
Well, there is an irony, which I think maybe you've noted, but I didn't pick up on it until fairly recently, which is that certainly the IDW people are dead set against postmodernism, but one feature of postmodernism is a kind of a suspicion of authoritative sources of knowledge, and I think I personally have a reasonably cynical view of human nature, and I believe that people, it's not like we're all trying to be dishonest, but we tend to present versions of reality that are not objective and that often accord suspiciously with our self-interest, again, whether we're aware of it or not. So I am kind of duly skeptical of, in a way, sources of information generally, but the funny thing is that particular aspect of postmodernism, which some of these people are so critical of, they evince in spades, right? I mean, Bret and Eric Weinstein certainly. And it's just a funny thing. And I don't know exactly what to say about it, because in realms that matter to me, like foreign policy, I actually think it's important that people, question some conventional sources of authority. The depictions of other parts of the world that you get, like right now, I would say depictions of, well, whatever our enemy is, right? Like I would say question depictions of China and Chinese motivation that you see in American media. It's probably a healthy, counterbalance. So anyway, I am personally ambivalent about how critical to be of people who counsel skepticism, but there certainly is this irony with like the Weinsteins about them evincing sometimes the very thing that seems to be at the heart of their criticisms,
So one thing I'd say to that, Bob, and I think Matt would completely agree with this, is that what we don't want to argue against is any skepticism of the mainstream establishment or institutions. Like in actual fact, it often gets lost in the shuffle, but both Matt and I have been advocates for like methodological reform in, the kind of the thing which follows from the replication crisis, but which is always
in psychology,
been an issue.
Which is, for people who haven't followed it, it's just that it turned out that a lot of psychological results that were repeated endlessly in the media and other places rested on a shaky foundation. Nobody had bothered to replicate the experiment, or they replicated it and found that they didn't get the same result, and nobody was interested in publishing that or whatever. But for whatever reason, psychology has this kind of so-called replication crisis, and that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, but not just psychology, across like all social sciences, and also more concerningly across including medical fields, which includes things like drug companies not pre-registering studies and selecting specific outcomes. So I always, and I teach courses that like try to emphasize this about being skeptical about research literature, how to read research literature critically, how not to take academics at their word at what they're, promoting, especially if it's their particular theory, which they happen to be finding constantly positive results for. That can be because your theory is very good, or it can be because you're very committed to your theory. But like, say, for example, your recent guest, John Horgan, who famously skeptical of scientists, right? And critical of a lot of the claims that they would make to authority. And I think he often has legitimate kind of quite well-founded criticisms about scientists overreaching the evidence base, right, to make bigger claims. But he has this, and I think this is a tendency which is reflected across people who evince that kind of attitude, and also amongst, in foreign policy terms, the people who might be more skeptical of like neoliberal institutions or mainstream media narratives, that they don't, what they tend to do is compartmentalize their skepticism and then evince a kind of credulity or partisan credulity towards alternative sources or critical knowledge, people who are critical. So people like Matt Taibbi can be very critical of the American media establishment and then will be very kind of sympathetic towards, say, Bret Weinstein's claims about being, silenced for ivermectin promotion. And I take issue with the kind of applying your skepticism unevenly and to, in many respects, maybe Matt Taibbi is slightly different in this than like a Bret Weinstein, but what they're counseling as like healthy skepticism, it doesn't look like that. It looks like reactionary skepticism that is often rolls along political lines. And it's that which I have an issue with. Like people like Stuart Ritchie, Ben Goldacre, or even John Horgan on his better moments, are people that I see a lot of value to. But what like I don't see value to is like why they would be, like in John Horgan's case, so sympathetic to Rupert Sheldrake, right? Or that kind of thing. So it's the uneven application of skepticism that I take issue with.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there. I keep wanting to get to the Weinsteins, and I'm determined to do it, but this leads me to want to say one thing about Scott Adams. It was an example where I thought, maybe you were in one place a little harder on him than you might have been if he was, from the left, but you'll probably, correct me and argue otherwise. And the point, but it speaks to the scientific authority point. Now, you did convince me that he's an extremely annoying person, and that was really valuable. I had never paid any attention to Scott Adams. I knew he was this Dilbert guy who, wound up as a Trump supporter, and I always thought it was interesting. In a way, it makes sense, right? Because I think, I didn't read much Dilbert, but I gather it was like about how horrible the plight of the working person was in America in a certain sense, right? Like the workplace is this horrible, oppressive place. So in a way, it makes sense that he would, go along with Trump in yearning for the America of yore when I don't know what the romantic myth is about how great work used to be. But anyway, before China stole all the good jobs, whatever. Anyway, that's a tangent. The point I want to focus on is, where Scott Adams says something that I think is strictly speaking true, and you were very critical of. It was like, okay, trust the science is one thing, but don't trust the scientists. I think there is an important distinction there. I trust that science in the long run, does tend to move toward truth, perhaps less erratically when it studies less complex systems, like not human beings, like physical, just physics or something. But I think in all of these realms, over time, it's a process that moves in the direction of truth. And in that sense, I trust it, and I trust, whenever there seem to be valid scientific findings, I trust them. That's not the same thing as saying you should always trust the scientists. I mean, sometimes that's manifestly impossible because they disagree with one another. And there is also this thing of scientists hiding behind the cloak of science. Like I think Tony Fauci said something like, if you doubt me, you're doubting science. And I don't know, that sounds a little like something, that a figure, invoking religious authority might say, So I thought, now granted, where Scott Adams went with that point, he was clearly, trying to get his audience to not take seriously some things that should be taken seriously and to get them to just discount, the testimony of everyone but him and people he approves of. I grant you that. But I thought you could have granted more, validity to the generic distinction he was making.
Yeah, look, if you take that particular statement in isolation, then it's totally anodyne and agree 100%. Right? It's in fact, it's not even the slightest bit controversial. The whole premise of like a scientific community is that individual scientists are just, very flawed human beings, just as flawed as everyone else, and in love with their own theories and making all kinds of mistakes, right? And the whole concept of it is that you average out with the whole, and through competition, like healthy competition between scientists, they're always trying to prove each other wrong and push their own sort of theory and so on, then the truth will out. So if you take it in isolation, you're absolutely right, Bob. But as you kind of hinted at, he doesn't mean it like that. When he says, I trust science, I don't trust scientists, he means he trusts whatever version of science he wants to pick. Mm-hmm. He's using it as a rhetorical tool, really.
Yeah.
You can listen to that episode, or better yet, listen to the original Scott Adams thing, and I think you'd agree.
Listen, it's a good episode. I recommend people listen to it. It's great when you bring these people to life that I haven't paid much attention to. I mean, for example, this is embarrassing, but for there was a time when I think I kind of thought that James Lindsay and Douglas Murray were the same person. In other words, I would just see the name and they said this anti-woke thing. The names are both these kind of Anglo names and I'd never heard either of them. And I was kind of, but then, now it's easy. Okay. Douglas Murray has a British accent, among other differences. But, so that's, I don't, and the Scott Adams thing was fascinating.
There's a couple of things to add to that too, though, which is that, every conspiracy theorist says that they believe in science. Yeah. Every anti-vaxxer. Mm-hmm. says that they're not anti-vax, right? They just have some particular problems with this particular vaccine, So, and the Bret Weinstein and Heather Heying are the airbenders of this, just purely amazing in the way they run that. So, you have to be very skeptical of their rhetorical techniques. And as for people like Fauci, I mean, the first thing to keep in mind, of course, is that like health authorities, and government spokespeople and people responsible for communicating health directives to the public is not the scientific consensus, right? That's a separate thing with its own problems and its own issues and its own challenges. Right. For instance, in Australia, we've had recently the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine both available. There were some very small, statistically rare issues with the AstraZeneca vaccine. There was confused messaging from politicians and health authorities about it. And as a result, everyone sort of panicked and confused. And now everyone was, for a long time, it delayed the uptake of the AstraZeneca vaccine. So you can see that there are things which are, there are unique problems to public advisories and facing a public spokesperson, which can sort of, if you like, force them to, use language which has a level of certainty to it that you wouldn't normally find in the scientific literature. So I'm a little bit less, and Fauci is representing the mainstream scientific position like 90% of the time. We're talking, some edge cases here. So,
okay. So let's talk a little about the Weinsteins. Now, first of all, Matt, you have studied addiction in your psychological work. And I'm wondering, do you think Chris's relationship to the Weinsteins is one of addiction?
Diagnose me, Matt. What's my issues?
But let's just say Chris is, look, I have myself
This is great. This is an opportunity.
I have been accused of having an unhealthy fascination with the Weinsteins. I had to defend myself in the kind of the paywalled part of my Friday podcast with my Trumpist frenemy Mickey Kaus. And so because somebody accused me of being obsessed with them, I made the case for being deeply fascinated by them. But anyway, Matt, do you think Chris, somebody should stage an intervention?
Yeah, so Chris is routinely accused of being obsessed on Twitter, with some good reason. It's true that Chris does have a lot more energy and a lot more tolerance and willingness to consume this material and be irritated by it than a normal person. And I think he actually thrives on this dark energy. It makes him stronger somehow. I don't know what's going on exactly. And Chris is critical. But he's also quite quick to praise as well. It's just unfortunately that you have some characters that really aren't worthy of much praise at all.
Yeah.
Bob.
Yeah.
If I can
defend yourself? I'm not sure. I'll have to ask Matt. Matt, is he allowed to defend himself?
Yeah, I give permission. Yes.
The accused may speak. I perfectly cop to that the Weinsteins are like a personal fascination for me at the minute. But it's part of it is, I've heard your discussions with Mickey, and I think you pointed out a lot of things about them which make them kind of fascinating characters. From claiming that they have, grand theories that will revolutionize biology or physics to the way that they are at the center of so many of the conspiracy theories that they weave. It's interesting in that respect. But I will say that, I have an old blog which people could hunt out if they were so motivated to do. And what you will find if you go and look at that blog is that I'm listening to material from Psi advocates and 9/11 troopers, their material. And then I'm writing a blog kind of critical about it. So I've been doing this to myself for long before the Weinsteins were on the scene. And I if they move on to greener pastures, there'll be other people that do this. But for me, what's interesting most about those brothers and Heller, Bret's wife, is that they epitomize the science or the secular guru set, because what they tend to do is make appeals to having alternative scientific theories, or alternatively that they were what I've called science hipsters, that they believe the mainstream position, but they do it for reasons that you wouldn't have heard of, right? Bret believes in global warming, but not because of the IPCC reports and all of the converging evidence, but the YAML creators and so on. So there's that. I find that fascinating at the start because it's kind of a new breed to me of conspiracy theory. So in long-term interest, this was just like a new shiny box to unwrap. But since I've started paying more attention to them, I've find myself more and more where initially I had a more positive view and kind of find some things quirky. I've come to see a lot of them as more sinister. We've mentioned this undermining of, conventional sources, but okay, that's just a feature of the modern media environment and alternative media. But what concerns me is that they are often very loudly and in concert with other people, presenting their audience as that this is the way that you do good thinking, and this is what scientific thinking is. And then they introduce people to fringe theorists and conspiracy theories, and they promote their bespoke kind of approach to things as that is good science. And instead of them being silenced or kind of put on the main, on the edges, you've talked about this, Bob, that, appearing on Joe Rogan, appearing on Tucker Carlson, being interviewed by Megyn Kelly, that's not having a platform. And in the recent case with the, ivermectin issue and the anti-vax kind of advocacy, that they had a huge platform where the traditional anti-vax people aren't invited onto those spaces because people can identify them easily. But Bret and Hiller are now doing a book tour to promote a book, which includes stuff, their anti-fluoridation stuff, their anti-sunscreen stuff, a little bit about their alternative evolutionary theories. But Bob, you've written about evolutionary theory, and they make an argument that any feature which is complex, persistent, and costly is an adaptation, which is an insane definition of how they identify an adaptation. Because it would mean that, like, say, a cultural practice like bloodletting is an adaptive thing, right? Because it survived for centuries across multiple cultures. So how could that costly thing where people actually, give blood, how could that persist if it wasn't beneficial? And it leads to a worldview which is rife for naturalistic fallacy. Anyway, I've waffled on a lot there, but I see them doing genuine harm on the Rogan. I was listening to Rogan just before I came here, but with Bret and Hiller, and they advocated, it wasn't just the ivermectin stuff. They had alternative theories about orthodontics, and alternative.
I heard that. Yeah. I mean, look, I don't know. It could be true. What was interesting to me about that, it was so classic Bret in that first. So the idea is, there's something fundamentally wrong about how orthodontic practice is done, or whatever the adjectival form of. I'm not even sure I know the adjective or the noun that I need here. Anyway, we all know who orthodontists are. The idea is that the thing that they do needs to be informed by evolutionary theory. They're doing it in a confused way. But what was interesting to me was that, did you catch the part about where Bret, his teeth were messed up, he thinks, by a bad orthodontist who didn't, know his evolutionary theory or whatever, and was doing the practical thing. It's just interesting how often with both brothers, and again, he could be right about this problem with the practice. I have no idea. It's just interesting how often the alternative theories they're propounding are rooted in a personal sense of having suffered harm by virtue of the mainstream theory. This is something they both have in common, and it gets to, back to this irony you alluded to, which is that they both complain about how the establishment has at various times in their career, exercised the levers of power to oppress them or their thought or something, rather than let them, really get out there and test their ideas in the free range of idea testing. And now, if you look at what both of them are doing, both Bret and Eric, Bret has this theory of physics, and now credible people, you and I both had Tim Nguyen on our shows, a credible, guy who has a systematic critique of it. And Eric will not talk to him or any other qualified critics. Instead, he just goes on the power podcasts that he has access to and repeats it. And then, Bret is doing a comparable thing. And again, I think ivermectin, it could turn out to be of some therapeutic or prophylactic value. Having looked at the evidence, I haven't ruled that out. That's possible. But the fact is that Bret has said, flatly untrue and irresponsible things about it. In some cases, he's finally admitted it. He finally admitted that he was, he misconstrued the study that led him to say, ivermectin is 100%, the evidence suggests ivermectin is 100% effective or whatever. So he did kind of cop that plea, but still, he too is refusing to engage critics who have really gone down the line and mounted these systematic criticisms. And he too is just going on the Power podcast, retreating to the refuge of Joe Rogan and saying, yeah, Joe, it's only one case, but maybe the fact that you recovered from COVID is vindication of ivermectin. Well, give me a break. I mean, Joe Rogan took everything you can take, including a number of things that have been shown to be effective in treating COVID. And, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but this is the exact same fallacy that Bret finally kind of conceded he had made with the one study, because it was a study where they were using more than just ivermectin, and you couldn't infer anything about ivermectin per se from the results, leaving aside other shady things about the results. So I'll stop now, but I just have to say, there is this deep irony about the intellectual dark web having initially defined itself as this reaction to the oppressiveness of the power centers, and having defined its members as these fearless seekers of the truth who want nothing other than the vigorous exchange of ideas. And now you've got both of these guys refusing to engage their critics and retreating to what is increasingly the new form of power, which they actually have access to, some of these influential podcasts. So I'll stop now. I doubt I'm going to get a lot of blowback from either of you guys on this, but
that's it. You're just out of line. How dare you besmirch their good reputation, Bob? But no, Matt, I think, will have some points to make about the centrality of personal grievance narratives, because this kind of tendency to present yourself as central and treated unfairly is like really, really common. But I want to say, though, the point you made, Bob, about, mistaking correlation for causation, right? Which is essentially what happened in the Joe Rogan case. It's also mistaking the fact that, like, most people get better from COVID just by, just time. The vast majority of people just recover. So you could do nothing, and in most cases, you'll be fine. I'm not advocating that people do that. I just mean statistically that is the likelihood. So we don't even know that any of the things that Joe Rogan did, were helpful. And it could, but they could have been or could not be. But in the case of ivermectin, I think you can completely forget about ivermectin and just think about general standards of clinical evidence. And there's a hierarchy of evidence, and the really, really common pattern is like promising results in vitro studies, positive results in low quality small studies conducted by advocates, mixed results starting to appear with bigger studies, then high quality randomized control studies, pre-registered if possible, all results go away. None. And that's vast majority of clinical trials, not even just, these controversial ones which pick up in the culture war. So when people see the results from 1 and 2, like promising in vitro studies and some positive results from low quality studies, it's the standard response should not be, we need to put all our money into that, because clinicians have seen this hundreds and hundreds of times, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the reaction of skepticism is a normal one. It isn't just about political partisanship, but that kind of mistake, like when it came to the promotion of the Mu technique, or this is the alternative orthodontic method, right, to improve your jawline. There was a point in that interview with Joe where Heller and Bret say, in essence, that he's got this alternative method. It involves, you doing these exercises with your jaw and eating these kind of things. And then they say, and if you look at his website, or, he has these before and after photos, and it's shocking, the difference and how people can deny that. And then Joe responds by saying, and the establishment, like, how can they see these photos and just ignore the proof, right? And I was listening to wanting to scratch my ears out, because I was like, how can people not know, the basic standards of scientific? If that's your standard, every single, claim by some alternative health guru, they all have that. Testimonials, images showing I took these pills and, before and after. Alex Jones does it, but they don't seem immune to it. So it's that thing where there are plenty of people who fall for that kind of thing. And it's, in some ways, it's designed to hijack the way that our intuitive systems work. But what usually doesn't happen is that people then spend a good hour or so patting themselves back for their ability to think scientifically and to say, that they're teaching their audience how to appropriately assess these topics. And anyway, Matt, I went on. So please butt in. Don't allow me to dominate.
I will butt in if that's all right, Bob, and pick up a couple of those other points that you mentioned. I mean, you've hinted at it, that kind of epistemic horseshoe thing that's going on, or the irony of the IDW types who position themselves as being, very reasonable, open to evidence, that kind of thing. And, perhaps like you, my original concern was more with the postmodern stuff, which some of it, and the critical theory stuff, some of it is laden with jargon and buzzwords and so on. And some of the papers can read something like a conspiracy theory because it's like cherry picking bunches of, relatively disconnected things and building up a narrative and seeing things through a particular lens. But I mean, I think we've already covered it, but it's just clear at this point that unfortunately a lot of these characters who say that they're doing science are actually doing just scientism. It's just a thin veneer for conspiracy theories and just armchair speculation. And also where what they call critical thinking, like in the Scott Adams mold, is really, very selective critical theory. Again, just like a conspiracy theorist, that's what they do. They will, conspiracy theorists will happily pour through the details of the rubble of the 9/11 or whatever, and not use those faculties elsewhere. But the other thing you mentioned was about that personal narrative of grievance, which is just a feature of the Weinsteins, but also many of these figures. They almost always set themselves up as being beset by all sides and not being recognized for their talents by the DISC, the distributed idea suppression complex, or something similar, basically pushing them down and not letting them shine. And then actually, as you said, taking these personal incidents in their own lives, and it's a weird coincidence that all of their grand theories seem to be an extrapolation from this one case that happened to them. So look, this obviously not only betrays poor reasoning skills, because you do not draw such general conclusions from a single case, but it also betrays this other theme we see in our gurus, which is just this underlying current of narcissism. It's a mile wide. I mean, there's no nice way to say it, unfortunately, but it makes sense when you think about it, because you need a certain degree of self-belief and confidence, even to, speak publicly like the three of us are doing now, right? So, everyone's on this spectrum, but these people go further and present themselves as a unique source of knowledge, somebody who sees further and deeper than anyone else, and as polymaths. So that takes a certain level of narcissism to be able to take that big step. And the final thing I'll say is that grievance narrative, the narrative of suppression and so on, is very convenient, because the problem that gurus tend to have is that their grand claims as to their powers contrast remarkably with their relative lack of accomplishment in the real world, right? So I think at some level they realize this, so it's quite convenient to have a backstory that explains why Eric Weinstein, for instance, has not revolutionized the field of physics, right? There's an explanation
or economics,
for that.
which he says he would also have done if properly recognized.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I could say more, Chris. Yeah.
Well, I at the same time, I mean, I do, as you hinted at this, I do recognize. I mean, I think they're demonstrating tendencies that are part of human nature, and demonstrating them in some cases in amplified form. I recognize a lot of myself in them. I have my grievances. Who among us does not think that we should be like, that we deserve more credit for something or other, right? And it's very easy to focus on a single instance of that and let that start to, build from that experience into some kind of larger, theory of the world or something. I agree that, I think Eric in particular is an extreme case. Do you agree with me that he's more extreme than Bret in a way? I mean, you use the word narcissism. I wouldn't use that as I would not necessarily use that about Bret. Eric, I'm tempted, but
I would say that in terms of like obvious self-aggrandizement, Eric is top, right? Like he's obviously but Bret's narcissism is more. This might sound like a contradiction in terms, but it's more like stealth narcissism, or narcissism, which when you're next to Eric, you look modest. if like Trump was next to Eric, they might have a battle. But apart from him, I'm not sure anybody whose comparison point is Eric, it will come out looking, like they're self-aggrandizing. But when you take Bret in isolation and listen to their content, like Stuart Ritchie recently reviewed their book for The Guardian. It'll come out in a week, and I've read it. It's a very nice review. And
Brett and Heather's book?
Yes.
It's a new book called, what is it, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century or something?
21st Century.
Yeah.
Yes. And Stuart Ritchie is of note for anybody who doesn't know, who's somebody who wrote a book called Science Fictions, and which is a book detailing all of the issues with the modern scientific environment, right? Including research methods, but also how public journals work and so on. So he's not somebody who's naively rah-rah about, modern science. But one of the factors that he emphasized about that book is that it just comes across as like extremely arrogant, and that the continuing theme is this presentation of themselves as people who have seen beyond the partisan and the limitations of the modern science, and they see things on the horizon. And you don't even have to read into it, because as you've played clips, and so have we, they say that. They say, there's nothing more pleasurable to me than looking around and thinking everyone else is wrong, and I'm so far ahead they can't even see it. And that's not me doing a parody. That's almost word for word what Bret said, not Eric.
And Bret said to Eric, this is something we have in common. When everybody says you're full of shit, we take that as positive reinforcement. He almost, maybe what I just said is a slight caricature, but he almost said that.
No, he did. And he said more along those lines that we're not, because there's not just a case of like being willing to forge your own path and stand up. Like, there's good reasons to do that sometimes when there's, the people in the replication crisis who were saying that the power opposing literature was like biased and bad. We're initially in a minority, and, we're heavily criticized as data terrorists and all these kind of things. But so it isn't an issue about believing in yourself. It's more in this kind of self-satisfied and a heuristic that if other people think that you're wrong, that is an indication that it's not that you should go and check, like, am I actually right? And then you do the research and you say, well, no, I think I'm still right. They don't get self-doubt from that. They get vindication that, like, they are more correct the more that people disagree with them. Mm-hmm. And that heuristic, if you apply it, means that you simply can't be wrong. You can only be vindicated or not yet vindicated. That's the only two options.
Yeah. It's tough because, I do. There are things, they emphasize. I mean, like Bret, this one thing he says, I think is worth remembering. You alluded to it, that, a lot of these big studies are financed by pharmaceutical companies. And if you have a generic drug that nobody can make money off of, it's hard to get somebody to do one of these huge randomized trials. It's not in anybody's interest to pay for it. So like, that's an example of a good point he makes. I try to keep an open mind, on this stuff. Like I said, I haven't totally shut the door on, ivermectin. It's just that, I mean, as you suggest, he carries, and it's really kind of surprising, with Bret. Like, there was one point where he was talking to his fellow believers and he said, okay, so on ivermectin, we're done, right? There's just no doubt anymore. It's like, we're solid, right? And no point in even disputing it anymore. And it's like, don't you understand that a scientist is just supposed to never talk like that, right? It's like nothing is, strictly speaking, nothing is ever proved in science. It's just, it hasn't been disconfirmed. And some theories get to a point where they merit tremendous confidence, but you just shouldn't talk like that. I don't understand it. Anyway.
Yeah. As you said, Bob, it's not that there isn't a sprinkling of fair points in, we're using Bret and Heather as an example here, but amongst all of them, there's kernels of truth in pretty much the problem is what they do with it. They kind of use those as a springboard for a bunch of quite insane things. And, and that's why we're interested in them, because, most people out there, like the audience of these gurus are not sort of tinfoil hat crazy people generally. They're generally people who are curious, who are skeptical, who are interested, who want to, seekers perhaps, but there's nothing wrong with their fans, I think, to a large degree. But
Chris
why
Chris
we're
looks like
particularly
he has
sensitive to
doubts
them?
about that.
Well, okay, some of their fans, I mean, the super fans, there are problems,
Yeah.
but I'm talking the quiet ones, the broader group. But that does make them particularly pernicious, because they're very good at what they do. I've made the analogy of the fellow who played the president in The West Wing, who, I don't remember the actor's name.
Martin Sheen.
Oh, Martin Sheen.
Yeah.
Now he's more presidential than any real president, right?
Yeah.
He's an actor. He's a good actor. He does a great job of portraying a president because he's set his mind to do that. And what we see with people like Bret and Heather, is they've set their minds to play the role of the scientist, and they're good at it. And unless you really devote a lot of effort and have your antennas tuned to the problems with what they're doing, then it's quite easy to fall for them. So it's quite worrying.
Yeah, I feel more charitably toward Bret than Eric, but that's maybe just me. What were you going to say, Chris?
I just wanted to, before I forget, mention that in the case of ivermectin, I've heard that about, drug companies won't be able to profit and stuff. But I would just note that ivermectin, the actual brand, I believe is owned by Merck. And most of the, US, there are generics, but the people who make generics are also drug companies. And so there's plenty, if there was something that was super effective, drug companies would be profiting off it. They would make their own brands, or they own the brand. So I don't believe that most of the people making that claim have done the work to check, what the incentive structure is with profits. And that aside, it kind of, what Matt said about them being good at playing the role of scientists, I would extend that to their ability to add disclaimers and what we've tended to name strategic disclaimers. And I now consider myself a connoisseur of this genre because I hear it so much. And you will hear Bret and Heller found this document about PCR tests, right? And that they thought that this document revealed a conspiracy where they were having more stringent standards for identifying COVID amongst the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. So there would be more cases amongst the vaccinated, right? And this was, it was in America, so CDC or WHO, can't remember, I think CDC policy. And they based it on this reading of a PDF document that they got. I seen that document, read it. It took 5 minutes to read. And the reading of it to me was immediately clear that it was not talking about the criteria for making the test. It was the criteria for sending samples to the CDC in order to validate the strain of coronavirus or whatever. So they needed a certain level of concentration in order for it to be worthwhile to send to them. Right. So, but that was my reading of it, but I'm not an expert in that. So what I did was I spent maybe an hour, but I sent some messages to people I know who are experts in that and said, is my reading of this right? Is this what I think it is? They checked it and said, yes, it is, a couple of different people. And then I made a thread about it. And Bret and Heller, you can say to their credit, next week came out when this was pointed out to them and said, we made a mistake. Right. But the way that they admitted they made a mistake was to say, to make a big deal out of that, okay, they need to correct one thing that they misspoke, but then they said, but the other thing is that since we talked about this document, it's now being the address that you click doesn't go to it. So they're obviously trying to hide something. So even if we weren't right about the specifics, they're still trying to hide. And so instead of getting the message that they made a mistake which betrays a real sloppiness, because they went on a kind of 15-minute rant about the cabal that was putting their fingers on the scale. So, but their correction was short and then pivoted to how, even if they got that detail wrong, they're still right. And that to me is like, it's just what they all do. Not the Weinsteins are really good examples of things, but they're not the only ones doing that. And it is people on the other side of the spectrum as well. And sorry, Matt.
But that's one example from Chris there, a specific one to just illustrate. But it's hard to overstate the links which they put those strategic disclaimers too. I mean, the meme, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens, like it's that level when they talk about, we're not doing conspiracy theories, we're exploring conspiracy hypotheses. So then they will go on and argue forcefully for their conspiracy hypothesis. And then, basically evince like 99% certainty in it or 100% certainty and move on as if it is definitely true. Yeah. And it is just it is a rhetorical maneuver. So the defenders can always say, oh, but they issued this caveat, they issued that disclaimer and so on. And they did, but they base their entire reasoning from the absolute cast iron certainty that what they have speculated to be true is in fact actually true.
Yeah. And, I got to say, I want to say one more thing about Eric, but then we probably said enough about the Weinsteins, but I'm sure there are people out there now thinking like, man, you guys are obsessed. But I just want to say, like, we're in the middle of a pandemic that has the entire world's attention. And Bret Weinstein is one of the, ivermectin aside, he of course is he's not a classic anti-vaxxer. He's not against all vaccines, but he's a skeptic of this vaccine and is arguing that there are hidden side effects that haven't been admitted or documented. And again, I'm agnostic. Could be the case, but I think there's good evidence that he's overstated the level of concern that's appropriate. But the main thing I want to say is, like, he's about the most, how would I put it? If you put all the anti-vaxxers, or the vax skeptics, the skeptics of this vax on a spectrum, and from most manifestly crazy to those that are kind of getting serious attention, at least by people like Joe Rogan, from people like Joe Rogan. Yeah. Bret is like right there. Respectable. There's only a couple of people. He's a very important specimen right now in that regard. And then that aside, the whole intellectual dark web, Eric came up with the name, launched the thing, and actually used Bret's kind of notoriety, fame, whatever, from his his anti-woke Evergreen episode. And that's another huge issue now, is the culture wars, the woke, speech codes. And these guys just embody so much that is of interest right now that I'm not that apologetic about discussing the dynamics. Go ahead, Chris.
I'll very briefly say that I think in some sense, to provide another justification, Bret and Heller are now on a book tour to promote their hunter-gatherer book, right, which was written, I think, before or like during the COVID thing, but it doesn't focus anyway on vaccines right, or that kind of thing. But the people that are interviewing them are studiously avoiding the topic of vaccines and what they've been done. And I would suspect that's at the request of publishers or Bret and Heller directly. They've talked about, they're going to step back from focusing on that topic. But I'm glad that they're not going to be, directly focusing on anti-vax rhetoric anymore. But I think the public sphere or do a disservice to just forget about what they did. And like Michael Shermer just interviewed them yesterday. He's, getting blowback on Twitter, but what does that matter? But this is a leader of the skeptic movement, and somebody who has published books about anti-vaccine rhetoric and that kind of thing. And he had two, as you say, of the, people that are leading proponents of the dangers of this vaccine, although they have expressed concerns about other vaccines, but and he didn't ask them a single question. And it speaks to me about the point that you make about, the issue of not having any challenging conversations with people that disagree with you, yet constantly editorializing that's what your brand is. Right. You're the one having the difficult conversations and stuff. Right. And I know you've criticized the IDW about this before, but I think that's part of the thing that's so galling is like there's an unrepentant or maybe just completely unaware level of hypocrisy that is hard to overstate in some of the figures.
I agree. Let me so I say one more thing about Weinstein, and then ask you one more general question about the guru biz, and then maybe we can kind of move toward closure. But I have to ask this question about Eric, and this does get to the dynamics of guruhood. So he, you remember this tweet of his where, okay, so this was after, Tim Nguyen, credentialed mathematician and kind of, in a way mathematical physicist, had systematically critiqued his paper. You had given Tim a platform. I had given Tim a platform. Eric had found grounds for dismissing all this, refused to engage in debate. And then Eric came out with this tweet where this kind of melodramatic tweet where he was saying, okay, basically, it barely was even subtext that he was threatening legal action and almost guaranteeing that it was going to happen. And then at the end, it was like to his followers, wish me luck, wish me well. I'm about to go into this battle, right? And I think any of us, certainly you guys, had reason to wonder whether we were going to wind up in court, right? I mean, I didn't think that so much about me. I figured, well, it's maybe Tim and his cohorts that Eric feels so oppressed by. Maybe you guys, but it was very much, it was a threat. And it doesn't happen. At the same I mean, maybe it will, but what happened to that? That was a while ago.
Yeah, and the one thing you didn't mention is that he'd found some comment from somewhere. I forget what it was. It was like an off-color
Discord
kind of Discord joke or something from some anonymous source. But in his complaint, he was claiming that his family was being threatened with assault and sexual assault or something like that, and sort of included vaguely people. Tim Nguyen in particular, but even us was sort of tangentially.
He name checked you guys in one tweet, or in the course of that conversation. I think he the Twitter handle of your podcast he deployed, I believe.
Matt, just to mention the specific for that was that the tweet was the Discord message was by Dan Gilbert, and it was an off-color joke about Eric had said something on Joe Rogan, and then he made a joke about, I heard it like this, so I'm going to promote on Twitter now that Eric wants to like rape children or something. It was it was an off-color joke, but it also, he didn't do it, right? It was a comment on a Discord.
He was pretty clearly making a joke about taking things out of context. They were doing this kind of, were doing this kind of hate watch of Eric on Joe Rogan, hate watch in the, not, the loose, the relatively benign sense of the term, but, and they were doing live commentary, and I guess the guy said, now I'm going to go out saying that Eric wants to do blank, clearly meaning that this one phrase could be taken out of context. It was obvious. And
yes,
Eric said something about like the strange way that we divorce sex and children. Right. But in context, he wasn't saying, but that you could take it out and be like, Eric said it's strange that children and,
But that was the guy's point, that if you took this out of context, it would be. So anyway, the thing I wanted to say,
we had that guy on the podcast. That was what I wanted to mention.
Before this. So, anyway, the thing I wanted to say is like, you might think, I mean, my first reaction to that when I saw Eric's tweet, it was so clearly saying something momentous is going to happen. I'm going to do it, folks. These guys are going to be sorry they ever messed with me. And I thought, well, you make a claim like that. Seems like you're going to pay a price if you don't deliver. Like, won't your followers lose faith or something? But maybe I'm starting to think he's never going to deliver, A. And maybe it's part of the dynamics of guruhood that, no, you won't pay much of a price. I mean, right? Like, is that your take? Is like,
well, this is a famous cult dynamic, of course, where they make prophecies.
Yeah, well,
and you know, on this date we're going to migrate to the comet or something like that,
yeah.
And it doesn't happen. But it has the community is surprisingly resilient to these failed claims. I realize that's a bit of a stretch of a comparison, but I think it's the same kind of dynamic that you will not pay a price to make those claims.
Yeah,
I think. If you look at Eric's Reddit community, he has paid a price for like not starting his podcast up again. And he's made olive threads up with this kind of tone in the past, and nothing has kind of come. He's hinted at dark forces and that he's going to, you know, fight back against them soon. And I don't know, you know, maybe Eric is making complex legal plans about how he's going to take down all of his critics, and these will be revealed. But I think that even if that's the case, the thing that he's often responding to is, like Matt said, he kind of conflates everything, you know, some negative comment or things that he's seen on the Discord or that some anonymous person said, and like the paper critique that Tim Nguyen had made or our podcast, and he kind of puts them all together and you know, implies that there's some dark, sinister forces behind it, that and that they're all engaged in these kind of, you know, misogynistic, or they, you know, or at least are willing to support people that will attack his family. And like, it's not hard for us to say, and I said it when he made that thread, like, we don't support anybody that would, you know, harass Eric personally or his family. No, you know, there's lots of people say stupid stuff on Twitter, but like, it doesn't matter. It's still not okay. But that's not what like Tim Nguyen's critique is. That's not what we're doing. And it is strange when you see yourself kind of being lumped in together and implications of legal threats. And it's clearly done with the view to, I don't know if it's conscious or not, but it certainly has the effect of making people second guess public criticisms, right? Not Matt. It does make me, I'm more worried about these things when Matt's like, no, just, you know, it's fine. Yeah.
I'm probably too blasé, but, you know, it is a common dynamic. Like, it's, you know, the Scientologists are suing everybody left, right, and center, and cults in general very much want to build up the sense that they are under attack by nefarious forces to sort of build that community and bind them together. And I think it was pretty transparent that Eric was hoping he would foster a kind of groundswell of you know, activity from his followers to leap into the fray and fight the good fight on this very important issue of him. But it didn't seem to materialize.
Yeah. So that word followers, that leads to maybe, let me back up and ask a generic question and then we can call it a day. But back to this question of whether, like, what is new here? Like, you know, on the one hand, when I listen to the people that you kind of focus on in your podcast, you know, often I can think, well, like sometimes you'll be focusing on even with Scott Adams, kind of, although he's a very eccentric character and doesn't deserve to be compared to any like serious columnist of the past or anything, but you know, it's political. He's making arguments about politics, right? It's political argument. And we don't generally think of that as inherently being, you know, kind of a guru activity. You know, with various, I mean, there are various people, analogs to the various people you talk about from the past whom I might say, well, we didn't used to call them gurus. What's going on here? And one thing I wondered is, is one thing that's new, this idea of the follower. Now, people have always had followers, maybe in some sense, but social media has made it this quantifiable thing, and it's put people, I mean, even like, just academics, very much in touch with a kind of a fan base, and put them in touch with like what kinds of things excite their fans and get them positive feedback and so on. So I guess, I don't know. The question is partly to what extent is whatever you see about this that's new a product of technologies that give new meaning to the term followers, make that a much more tangible thing that you're much more in touch with. We didn't used to use the word the way we use it now, right?
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there. Like, a lot has been talked about, and I've experienced it myself, where when you listen to podcasts, right, you feel intimately connected to the hosts. And I remember that years and years ago when I listened to Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, one of the hosts died. And I hadn't been aware that I had built, a psychological connection. I liked them, but, just as podcast host. But I remember when he died feeling, actually emotionally hit by it. And it kind of surprised me, like, oh, wow, this guy has never met me, knows nothing about me, but I felt a connection, right? And that's one of it can be a perfectly harmless or a neutral thing, but this one way kind of psychological connection that people build, and podcasts are good at it, but you can do it through any medium where there's a connection. It can be YouTube, could be whatever. That I don't think you got through written text before. That's one thing, is that, the new technologies, audio and visual, that makes a difference. But the other thing is that, like, with Web 2.0 and the establishment of, all these like micro communities that not everyone, but like, especially podcasters and whatnot, tend to have, Patreons, their own Discord servers or so on. YouTubers have them as well. That it does run the risk of cultivating a kind of cult of personality dynamic. And I think that people have to, as their like level of fame increases or whatever, or if they're already very famous, they have to be aware of that dynamics, not just how it affects their followers, but how it affects them. And Bob, our last conversation, which we had on our podcast, there was something that really stuck out to me, right? And you've mentioned, how are you share some of the characteristics about, the sense of grievance that we all have about our brilliance being unrecognized in our time. You're doing all right. But you talked about having the opportunity when you were doing some meditation course with someone a teacher got sick and you had the possibility to record the guided meditations, right? I think, teacher was a specialist in the guided meditations. And that it gave you pause, and that you ended up not doing it because you didn't feel right about it, right? For whatever reason, whether you didn't feel qualified or you had some uneasy feelings about it, you didn't do it. Now, in contrast to that, I think that impulse that you had is something that lots of public intellectuals would lack. I'm not saying they're all going to teach meditation, but this hesitation about, is this something, that I should do that could lead to, an attachment with my followers? And in contrast, I will say, for various reasons related to our show, we've been doing Sam Harris's Waking Up app, right? And on the one hand, I will praise it by saying it's quite a good app for giving you a daily meditation practice, a reminder. The instructions are good. Sam has a very soothing voice. But that's also the comment that I would make, that like, it didn't need to be Sam's voice for this app, right? It could be a voice actor, and the content could be exactly the same. But part of the selling point of it is that it is Sam. Sam is like your personal meditation teacher. And I think he doesn't grapple enough, and not just him, but many of the people in this set, with the fact that that kind of thing, it doesn't just build up an intellectual following. It's building an intimate psychological following, which can be then completed with your political takes. And I guess all of that are things that I'm concerned about in the modern environment that didn't exist when you're just reading someone's column in the New York Times, right? Maybe you go to see their talk, but you don't have the same connection.
Yeah, I debated Sam in Los Angeles, I don't know how many years ago now, 10, 12. And I mean, when he walked out there, you know, it was a Sam-friendly audience. It was some convention of atheists or something. It was a Sam-friendly audience. But I mean, when he walked out there, it was like a rock star had walked out there. I mean, it was not.
That's like me at conferences, Bob.
Well, yeah, I'm sure. And, you know, this is a whole nother conversation about, I mean, I don't begrudge him. I mean, you know, if you believe in your ideas, maybe you shouldn't worry about building up capital in one realm and then translating that into people taking your political ideas seriously, something. I don't know, but you're right. It's a difference. I mean, he's got the instinct, for sure. Were you going to say something, Matt?
Yeah, I guess I'd just say that it's important to recognize that the parasocial relationships of one kind or another are normal and commonplace. So, you know, the appeal of, say, you know, actors and actresses is you know, the reason they get paid so much is because we do build up that thing. And, you know, politicians do it as well, you know, from John F. Kennedy to Donald Trump. And it's maybe not necessarily healthy there. It does seem to be dangerous a little bit more, has the potential for danger when you position yourself as an intellectual and self-help guide, as an epistemic center, and combine that with like that sort of socio-emotional parasocial relationship. So, you know, it doesn't have to be that way. Like, you know, as you guys have been sort of hinting at, you don't do that, Bob, at least not that I can tell. Maybe you're very subtle or something.
Not successfully, at least.
Not successfully. And, you know, you don't have to do it. Like an old-fashioned guru, I mean, someone who might have been a guru but sort of isn't, is I think, someone like Richard Dawkins. Now, I read all his books, right? And this is the medium as well, right? So books do not transfer personality like a podcast or a movie does. Now, I read all his books, super duper fan, certainly felt that kind of intellectual satisfaction, you know, of following someone's reasoning and being on the same page and all that stuff. So you get that sort of, but I didn't and still don't feel the slightest bit of personal attachment to the guy, probably partly due to his personality, but also partly due to the fact that it was books. Like I'd be more upset if Kate Blanchett or Toni Collette kind of died or something, you know, to Australian actresses I like.
It's funny. I was wondering the other day why you haven't done Dawkins, because he did enter this fray a little, right? He's got a little IDW in him, and you know, he's very, you know, outspoken about the evils of religion, which is the way Sam entered the picture, and there's a certain amount of overlap, and he's got, you know, his issues with Islam, which I would say border into Islamophobia is conventionally defined personally, but so it's interesting. It's interesting that you don't think he quite qualifies.
Well, he's on our list.
He is on your list. Okay, so you're not saying he's not a guru. You're just saying he's not an effective one the way some of these people are.
No, not in terms of that. He doesn't try to develop those parasocial, as far as I can tell. So,
okay.
When I say he's on the list, I mean, one thing to emphasize is that we, you know, don't just want to cover people that are, you know, full marks on all our guru scores, right? We like to cover public intellectuals, influential thought leaders, however, across the spectrum. And, you know, we'll crank up the barometer and feed them in and see what comes out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You were going to say one.
Dawkins did have a foundation like built around him, right? But I think he's in recent years become famous for his twittering, which is somewhat unfortunate for. It would be much better if his legacy was his books, but
I should just say, well, actually, Dawkins is just a random example. I could have named any other kind of sort of guru or public intellectual character that sort of made their name before social media and Web 2.0 and all that stuff. Like, what about Bertrand Russell or George Orwell or Aldous Huxley or, there's so many names, right? But the medium is important. And, I just feel like these days we deserve a better class of public intellectual.
A better class of gurus. Okay. So, well, thanks you guys. I feel a little bad for having steered us into such a long, Weinstein, trek. Especially given Chris is in recovery. It's like, offering just one hit of crack, Chris. Just this will be the last hit. And then, we saw what happens. He's a mere shadow of his former self now.
But look, one thing though, to justify again what we've just taken part in, like a good addict, is to say that, like, I think a point that I would want to emphasize, even when we're drilling down to, specific instances with what the Weinsteins have done or said, is that they're like a hyper stimulus of this set that we're interested in. But they're not the only ones. And the patterns that you can identify through what they do, you'll see it all over the sphere, and you'll see it outside the intellectual dark web as well. You will see it in the woke spectrum, and you will see it in, it maybe closer to home, Bob, would be, like Jimmy Dore types and the anti-imperialist set, or however they define themselves, Glenn Greenwald and so on. So I would just caution that, like, even if people don't like us beating up on the Weinsteins, you can apply the insights to across the spectrum, and you should. That's something I would emphasize.
Okay, well, it would be interesting to see you do Glenn. I think he'd be challenging in a way, but
he's part of the issue maybe with him and some of the other people is that, like, you mentioned about the issue of just traditional pundits, and Glenn, in many respects, actually, to me, comes across like that. That, like, I find a lot of stuff that he says objectionable and stuff, but it's more his punditry. So. Yeah, but we could definitely cover him.
Yeah.
We don't want to pathologize like guruness,
right.
like put like a clinical definition on it and put people into a box of guru or not. It's really, I mean, we focus on the characters to give it some sort of focus. That's right, but it's a spectrum, and we're all even relatively normal people are vulnerable to doing some of these things and falling prey to some of those things. And yes, you have the super stimuli. But you have people across the spectrum. And so really what we're hoping to do is just get people to exercise their critical thinking and their critical literacy and, get that skepticism dialed in a bit, I guess. So it's not veering into conspiracism, but is more at that sweet spot. I mean,
and
also just to have fun. I
should say there's a lot of, there are names I haven't mentioned that you've done that Gwyneth Paltrow, Nassim Taleb, or Taleb, however he pronounces it. So there's there's a ton of people. People should peruse your archives. And if they are interested in the Weinsteins, there's plenty of that there. And I've written about Eric, in a piece called Is Eric Weinstein a Crackpot? You can Google that. What else do you want to say about, the name of the podcast is Decoding the Gurus. What's it, you want to give us your Twitter handles or the Twitter handle of the podcast or anything?
Yeah, for me, personally, it's C_Kavanagh, which is my name. And then at Matthew Arthur C. Dent, right? Like the Hitchhiker's character. And then
the character.
The podcast is Gurus Pod. Isn't that right? That's the handle on Twitter.
Just one word?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if you type in Decoding the Gurus to podcast player, you'll find our podcast. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm
available on all good podcast
Twitter,
players.
easy to find.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. We could have gone on a lot longer. Maybe someday we will in the future, but at least we've said the very last word about the Weinsteins, and you will never hear that word escape Chris's lips again. There's nothing more to be said.
We might be tempted to do the episode that they did with Joe Rogan, but that's Joe Rogan, so we'll
right.
be
That's more of a
looking at
Rogan thing than a Weinstein thing. Could have been anybody. Could have been any guest. You chose the episode randomly because you're interested in Joe Rogan. I know how that works. Sure.
If Bret and Heather happened to be there, then
that's the way the cookie crumbles.
Yeah. No, I know how that works. Okay. Well, I look forward to that one too. All right. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Thanks, Bob. It's great.